They said, Mom, you better close the doors. And I said, what happened? And he said, there was a murder in Keddie. And I said, Keddie?
Because they've never caught this person? Is that the...
As he described striking the woman, the older woman, with the hammer.
It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked arranged. 3 bodies in the living room. Not scattered, not collapsed where they fell. Placed, bound, connected, and in the next room. 3 children slept through everything. Alive, unharmed. No struggle, no injuries, no explanation. But 1 child was missing. Not among the victims, not in the room, not anywhere in the house. Which means at some point, after everything that happened, someone made a decision to take her and leave everyone else behind. No forced entry, no clear motive, no arrests. And more than 40 years later, no one has ever been charged. Because what happened inside Cabin 28 wasn't random.
Yeah, but I didn't see it up close until, oh my God. It's fucking horrifying.
It required time, control, and a level of confidence. That doesn't come from guessing. It comes from knowing. And this is the open file. Keddie, California sits quietly in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Not isolated enough to feel abandoned, but removed enough that people stopped expecting trouble. A railroad town, a pass-through, the kind of place where routines matter more than surprises. Just off State Route 70, there was a small resort. Cabins spaced close enough to hear movement, but far enough apart that nothing carried clearly at night. That detail matters because on April 11th, 1981, something happened inside Cabin 28. That should have been impossible to miss. Sue Sharp didn't come to Keddie by accident. She came there to reset her life. After separating from her husband, she moved across the country with her children, looking for stability, looking for something quieter. Cabin 28 wasn't luxury, but it was space. Enough room for her family, enough distance from everything before. And by that spring, life had settled into something predictable, which is why April 11th didn't stand out. There was no tension building, no known threat, no warning, just a normal day. That ended normally, until it didn't. That evening, people moved in and out of the cabin. Her sons were around. Friends came by. At one point, John Sharp and his friend Dana Wingate had been out in town. Eventually, they made their way back.
Rick Gregg slept in one room. My mom, Tina, and I slept in another room. And Johnny, there was a basement downstairs, and since he was the eldest, he got to sleep down there.
Sheila, Sue's daughter, left to spend the night next door. Cabin 27, a short walk, a familiar routine. Nothing about that decision felt unusual. Tina stayed close. At one point, she was next door watching television. Then around 9:30, she asked the time and went back home. That moment is one of the last confirmed times anyone saw her alive. Because after that, there are no more clear sightings, only what we can reconstruct. Sometime later, the structure of the night changed, not suddenly, not explosively, but deliberately, because nothing about what happened inside that cabin suggests panic or improvisation. The attackers didn't rush. They brought materials, They used multiple weapons. They restrained people. They controlled movement. And most importantly, they stayed. Long enough to bind 3 people. Long enough to assault them in stages. Long enough to move bodies afterward. That is not a short window. A nearby neighbor would later describe hearing something around 1:15 in the morning. Not loud, not clear, muffled, like something was being contained, which matches the scene investigators would eventually find, because whatever happened was controlled enough that it didn't fully break outside the walls of that cabin. The next morning, everything collapsed into reality. Sheila came back home. It was just after 10 a.m. She expected routine, change clothes, get ready for the day. Instead, she opened the door and walked into something her brain couldn't process. Not immediately, because what she saw didn't look like movement. It looked still, too still. Her mother, her brother, his friend, all in the same room, all on the floor, bound, covered in blood, and positioned in a way that didn't match a struggle. She didn't analyze it. She didn't investigate. She reacted, turned, ran back to the neighboring cabin, trying to explain something. That doesn't translate into words, but even in that moment, something critical was missed, because inside cabin 28, in a separate bedroom, 3 other boys were still there, alive, no visible injuries, no signs of resistance. They had slept through everything, through binding, through violence, through movement, through time. And that detail changes how this crime has to be understood, because it means one of 2 things. Either the attackers knew exactly who they were targeting, or they had enough control over the situation to leave witnesses alive, and neither of those scenarios points to randomness. At some point, someone realized Tina wasn't there, not in the bedroom, not in the living room, not anywhere in the house. And that's when the case stopped being one thing and became something else entirely. Because now, this wasn't just a homicide, it was an abduction. And investigators would later say Tina was likely central to the entire event. The scene itself reinforced that. 3 victims, all restrained, using materials that weren't all from the house. Tape, electrical cords, which suggest preparation, not just opportunity. The weapons told a similar story. A hammer, multiple knives, and evidence of a rifle used as a blunt instrument. Different tools, different methods, used across the same event. That's not escalation, that's control. The injuries weren't uniform. They were specific. Blunt force trauma, stabbing, strangulation. Each victim subjected to different forms of violence, which suggests this wasn't just about killing. It was about managing people during the act. And then there's the part that shifts everything. The bodies had been moved after death, repositioned. Blood patterns didn't match where they were found, which means someone stayed after the violence ended and adjusted the scene. That takes time and intent. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken doors, no shattered windows, which introduces a different possibility. The people who entered that house may not have needed to force their way in. Early in the investigation, attention shifted toward people nearby. Not strangers passing through, not unknown figures, people connected to that environment, people who understood the layout. 2 names came up repeatedly, Martin Smart and John Bo Bubede. Both had proximity, both had connections, and both raised questions. That never fully went away. Smart told investigators he was missing a hammer. At the time, that detail didn't fully land, but decades later, a hammer was recovered. In a pond near the cabin, investigators believe it was placed there intentionally, not dropped, not lost, hidden. Then there was the letter, written after the murders, a line that stands out because it doesn't explain itself. I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives. It doesn't name anyone. It doesn't describe the event, but it introduces something else. Acknowledgement. Both Smart and Bubede were investigated. Neither was charged. Both are now dead, which removes one path to resolution, but doesn't close the case. Because investigators don't believe. They acted alone, and that belief comes from something deeper than theory. It comes from structure, because what happened inside Cabin 28 required more than presence. It required coordination. The investigation itself didn't match the complexity of the crime. Evidence wasn't processed correctly. Some items weren't examined at all. Others were misplaced or ignored. Years later, investigators reopening the case would find things that had never been touched, including an envelope. Inside, a recorded phone call. A man referencing Tina after remains had been found. That recording had never been followed up. 3 years after the murders, someone discovered human remains in the woods, miles away. They belonged to Tina, which confirms something critical. She was removed from the scene, transported, and left somewhere else entirely. Shortly after that discovery, that phone call came in. The caller didn't guess. He didn't speculate. He referenced the case directly, which means whoever made that call knew something. When the case was reopened decades later, investigators weren't starting from scratch. They were working through everything that had been missed or mishandled or never pursued. Physical evidence was re-examined, old leads were revisited, and eventually something changed. DNA recovered from tape used at the scene matched a known living suspect, which means this case isn't just unresolved, it's active. Investigators now believe multiple people were involved, not just in the act, but in what came after, which explains how evidence disappeared, how leads stalled, how information didn't surface when it should have. And through all of it, one question continues to define the case. Why Tina? Why take her instead of leaving her at the scene? Investigators believe she saw something that couldn't be left behind, something that connected everything to someone, hoping that modern technology could reveal what early investigation could not. But even with those advances, the case remains unsolved, And that brings everything back to the same questions. Why this place? Why that night? Why those people? Because none of those are random variables. They're decisions. And decisions leave patterns, even when the people behind them disappear. More than 40 years later, the cabin is gone, but the case isn't. The victims are remembered. The timeline is still studied, and the questions are still waiting. Because what happened inside cabin 28 wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic in the way violence usually is. It was controlled. And control like that points somewhere, to someone, to a reason. Because what happened inside cabin 28 wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic in the way violence usually is. It was controlled. And control like that points somewhere, to someone, to a reason. That still hasn't been uncovered, and for now, that's where this file stays, open. Not because there are no answers, but because the answers that exist haven't been fully brought forward, which means someone still knows more than they've said. And until that changes, this case doesn't close, it waits.